Today, we are very pleased to welcome Professor Wolf Niemeyer to the Italian Archaeological School, and we thank him for accepting, very warmly, for accepting our invitation. We are delighted for several reasons. First of all, Wolf and Barbara, his wife, are very dear friends. Professor Niemeyer is one of the prominent scholars in Aegean archaeology from late prehistory to the Archaic period, and also because he will speak on a very interesting and complex topic, the interactions between Greeks, Phoenicians, and the inhabitants of the Iberian peninsula in the far western Mediterranean. Wolf Niemeyer is German by birth, by accident, but is Greek by election and choice, having served as the director of the German Archaeological Institute in Athens from 12 years, and as a leader of many significant excavations in Greece, Asia Minor, Italy, and Israel. He also believes that every day spent north of the Alps is a day wasted. Wolf Niemeyer began his career in Germany at the Max Planck Gymnasium in Göttingen, where he later studied archaeology, moving to Mannheim for his doctorate. At Marburg, he was a researcher on Minoan and Mycenaean seals, later becoming professor of archaeology at Freiburg and then Heidelberg. He spent his life between Germany and Mediterranean, conducting research at Santa Maria di Anglona in Basilicata, where he learned to speak fluent Italian, at Tel Kabri, the Israeli site with the famous Minoan-style frescoes, then at Miletus for 20 years, and then at Kolaios, Samos, and the Keramikos in Athens. For his work, Professor Niemeyer has received honors and affiliations, including membership in the German, Austrian, and American archaeological institutes, the Athens Archaeologia, and honorary doctorates from Liège and the National and Capodistria University of Athens. His bibliography has many contributions to list, and he has the rare merit of publishing the research rather than leaving them in the drawers or offering only some taste. I highlight just a few. The pottery, the Palast Stilkeramik from Knossos, the Kuros from Heiligenthal, das Orakelheiligtum des Apollo from Kalapodi, and Ursprung and Fruchtzeit des Raion von Samos, Topographie, Architektur und Geschichte. Today, he will speak on Kolaios of Samos, legendary Tartessos and Phoenicians and Greeks in the Iberian Peninsula. I'm particularly, as in my previous life, many years ago, I excavated for over 20 years in Morocco, where Greek artifacts are not uncommon and even reach Saharan regions, such as the SOS amphorae, found in Essaouira on the Atlantic coast, on the same latitude of Marrakesh, to have an idea. The story of a comb tells about the intricate relationship between Greeks, Phoenicians, and indigenous peoples. An ivory comb productive in Phoenicia was used in Andalusia before the dedication in the Iberian of Samos in the second half of the 7th century BC, if I well remember, even with traces with lice eggs, con uova di pidocchi. Now I give the floor to Professor Niemeyer. Thank you all for being here this afternoon, and once again, thank you to Wolf. Thank you.
Grazie caro Emanuele per l'invito e la gentile introduzione. Continuo in inglese. It's a great pleasure to be here with my friend Emanuele and with the Italian school, la Scuola Italiana, in questa sala, in this hall, la Aula Doro Levi, which is a special pleasure for me because I have very good memories of Doro Levi. I met him first in 1972. I was a PhD student working for my dissertation in Crete, and I came to Festos, and Doro Levi guided a group of Italian students in his excavation of the old palace of Festos, and he invited me to take part. And I said, oh, yeah, it's a pleasure, but I don't, at that time I didn't speak Italian, so I don't speak Italian. Oh, I will speak to you in German. So he guided his group in Italian, and then he changed to a perfect German to explain me the same things. And next time I met him, I had finished my PhD and was in my first international conference, the Cretological Conference, Cretologikos, in April of 1976. And you can imagine I was very nervous. Big names were sitting in front of me, which I knew only from literature, like Doro Levi, Sinclair Hood, and others, and my knees shaked, and I gave the paper, and then after that, Doro Levi came to me and gratulated. And this, I was in paradise, you can imagine. And after that, I met him several times in conferences, and we had always good discussions, and yeah, therefore it's a pleasure to be in the Aula Doro Levi. As an excavator and researcher at the Iberian of Samos, my interest in Tartessos was sparked by the account of Herodotus, 451-2, about the journey of the Samian merchant Kolaios to legendary Tartessos, from which he returned very rich. In 2019, my wife and I therefore followed the trail of Kolaios to the west, to western Andalusia, and this lecture is one of the results of this journey. I would like to thank Dirce Mazzoli, former director of the German Archaeological Institute in Madrid, and Esther Rodriguez González from the Instituto de Arqueología Junta de Extremadura in Mérida for important information and references regarding the archaeology of the Phoenicians in Spain and of Tartessos. Chronologically, Herodotus connects the voyage of Kolaios to Tartessos as a terminus antequem with the founding of Cyrene in Libya by colonists from Thera around 630 BC, who first settled on the island of Platea off the Libyan coast, then on the opposite beach of Atsiris, and shortly thereafter founded Cyrene. Herodotus tells that a Cretan named Korobios had led the Theraeans to the island of Platea. While the Theraeans returned to their island to recruit more settlers for the future colony, they left Korobios behind on the island. When Korobios ran out of supplies, he was rescued by the Samian Kolaios, whose ships happened to be blown off course to the island of Platea on its way to Egypt. The image at bottom left shows a Samian ship depicted on a late geometric amphora from the necropolis of Samos Pythagorean. According to Herodotus, Kolaios then wanted to continue his journey to Egypt, but was driven westwards across the pillars of Heracles, Gibraltar, by a strong easterly storm and finally landed in Tartessos. Herodotus continues, the trading center was yet not known at that time, so when the ship turned home to Samos, it brought back a richer haul of goods than any other Hellenic ship of which we have precise knowledge. The Samian skippers took on 1/10 of their profit, 6 talents, and made a bronze style cauldron with graven protomes around the rim. They dedicated it in the sanctuary of Hera, and for it, they used 3 kneeling, 7 ells high bronze colossi. End of quote. These bronze colossi were therefore about 3.50 meters high. According to Ulrich Gehrig's calculation, the entire gigantic votive offering was about 6 meters high. This slide shows a reconstruction by Elena Baltacavidi, who is here in front of me. Herodotus does not mention the goods with which Kolaios earned such a large sum. However, it was certainly silver, for which Tartessos, the 60 talents of silver that Kolaios brought back from Tartessos correspond to 1,440 kilograms. A group of 6 ivory combs from the Heraion, 2 examples of which you can see here on the left, can be dated according to context to around 630 BC and are connected with Kolaios' journey as argued by Brigitte Freyer-Schauenburg. She identified them as Tartessian and interpreted them as offerings made by Kolaios. On the right, for comparison, ivory comes from the Tartessian necropolis of Cruz de Nero near Carmona in western Andalusia. Kolaios was probably just one of the Samian merchants who undertook extensive trade journeys in the 7th century BC, which contributed significantly to the island's increasing wealth. In no other sanctuary in the Greek world has such a large number, variety, and geographical range of votive offerings from the Near East and Egypt, as well as from the Balkans, Italy, and the Iberian peninsula come to light. These were dedicated by merchants and also by mercenaries after the return from services in the armies of Egyptian and the Near East, an interesting phenomenon to which I will return, and probably also by visitors from Egypt and the Near East. Here, some examples, votives from the Near East here. Here from Egypt and from Cyprus. In the time of Kolaios, a Greek trading settlement of Naucratis was founded in the western Nile Delta with significant participation from Samos. When Kolaios erected his monumental votive offering, the Heraion of Samos was undergoing a major expansion and redesign with the construction of a processional road connecting the city with the sanctuary, the sacred road, the construction of the new temple, Hekatompedos, 100-foot temple 2, the associated altar, and the south hall. The Kolaios votive offering probably stood on a round base at the bend of the sacred way to the forecourt of the temple. This base, which is the only known archaic base on which the Kolaios votive offering would fit, was later covered by a second base, as you can see below right. The Kolaios votive offering expresses the aristocratic self-image of its founder. It was about the same height as Hekatompedos II on the left, the reconstruction section by Angelica Clemente, and about 1 meter higher than the colossal marble chorus of Ischys, which is about half a century later. With its bronze shining like gold under the Samian sun, the monumental votive offering visible from afar must have made a great impression on the visitors to the Heraion. Herodotus was very well informed about Samos. After fleeing from the tyranny of his native city of Halikarnassos, which was dependent on the Persians, he spent the years between 470 and 60 BC on the island, which became a second home for him, as Max Polenz aptly has put it. Samians will have told Herodotus the story of the expedition of Kolaios. There can be little doubt that it is historically accurate at its core. However, it seems implausible that Kolaios' ship on its way to the Nile Delta was unintentionally driven by an easterly storm from Libya beyond the pillars of Heracles to Tartessos. Herodotus has probably fallen for a Samian sailor's yarn. When Herodotus writes that the trading center of Tartessos was not yet known at that time, this is also not true, since Phoenicians and probably, as I think also Europeans, had reached the southwest of the Iberian Peninsula long before in search of metals, as will be discussed later. It is therefore more likely that Kolaios' journey to Tartessos was a planned action based on Phoenician and possibly also European information. In another passage mentioning Tartessos, Herodotus 163-5 connects it with Phocaea, the northernmost city of the Ionian Dodecapolis, at the bottom a reconstruction of the archaic Athena temple with a large griffin protones. According to Herodotus, the Phocaeans were the first Greeks to undertake long sea voyages and to make the Adriatic Sea, Tyrrhenia, Iberia, and Tartessos known. They founded the colonies of Massalia, which later became Marseille, around 555 BC, Emborion on the Catalan coast around 560 BC, then Alalia on Corsica, and after their flight from the Persian invasion to Alalia and the expulsion from there by the Etruscans and Carthaginians around 540 BC, Elea in Campania. With regard to Greek voyages of discovery to Tartessos, there is a contradiction in Herodotus. In the Kolaios passage, the Samians are the first to sail to Tartessos, while in the passage about the Phocaeans, it is them who were the first. Probably Herodotus is quoting two different local versions, which both Samos and Phocaea boasted of the same pioneering achievement, but which, as just mentioned, had long been preceded by voyages by the Phoenicians and probably also by Euboeans. When the Phoenicians came to Tartessos around 600, the Phocaeans came to Tartessos around 600 BC, they made friends with the local king Arganthonios, who ruled for 80 years according to Herodotus. There's no reason to doubt the real existence of Arganthonios. His 80-year reign seems hyperbolic, but it is possible. Ramses II of Egypt ruled for 70 years. Arganthonios tried to persuade the Phoenicians, the Phocaeans, to leave Ionia and settle in his territory, but could not convince them. When he learned that the all-powerful Persian Empire was beginning to harass the Greek cities on the western coast of Asia Minor, Arganthonios made a generous gift to the Phocaean friends, so that they could build a city wall, I quote, whose circumference, according to Herodotus, is not a few stadia long, and is built entirely of large, well-joined blocks. But despite their new walls, the Phocaeans secretly decided to flee with all their movable goods, images of their gods, and votive offerings on their 50 rowers to their colony of Alalia and Corsica. Herodotus continues, I quote, Arganthonios was no longer alive at that time, and by this he probably means that otherwise the Phocaeans might have accepted his offer to settle in the territory of Tartessos. Tartessos also appears in that are older than Herodotus and date from the 6th century BC. The geographer Hecataios of Milet, circa 560 to 480 BC, wrote a journey around the world, Periegis's Guides. Here you can see a reconstruction of his world map. Tartessos is located beyond the Pillars of Heracles at the western edge of the world, which is shaped like a flat disk and surrounded by the great Okeanos. From Hecataios Periegesis, only a few fragments quoted by later authors have survived. From the chapter on Europe by Stephanos of Byzantium, 6th century AD, about two cities in Tartessos, Elibirge and Ibila. In the vicinity of the latter, there are metals, gold and silver. The poet Anacreon of Teos in Ionia, circa 570 to 495 BC, wrote in a poem quoted by Strabon, in which he advocated renouncing too much wealth. I quote, to own Amalthea's horn, nor do I want to be king in Tartessos for 150 years. The mythical goat Amalthea, as you all know, raised the infant Zeus with her milk, using her broken horn as a drinking vessel. The horn of Amalthea then became a cornucopia and a general symbol of wealth and abundance, as on the Ptolemaic coin shown below on the left. The fact that Anacreon did not consider it necessary to mention the name of the unusual long-lived king Arganthonios and the wealth of Tartessos showed that these topoi were already familiar to his Ionian audience of the 6th century BC. The third source is of mythical nature and deals with one of the 12 labors of Heracles, namely the theft of the three-bodied Geryonois' herd of cattle. This is described by the poet Sisycharos of Himera, circa 550 to 40 BC, in his fragmentary preserved epic poem Geryonois, above two stone statues of Geryonois from the 6th century BC. In a fragment quoted by Strabon, it is said that Geryonois was born, I quote, opposite the famous Erythia at the boundless waters of the river Tartessos, with its silver-bearing roots in the cave of a rock. Erythia is a Greek name for the island on which the Phoenician colony of Gadir was founded, over which later the city of Cadiz was built. I will come back to this. Strabo continues, I quote, and in the space between the two mouths of the river, there used to be a city which, like the river, was called Tartessos, and the country, the Tartessian country. In the complete version of the Geryonois story as handed down by Pseudo Apollodorus, 1st to 2nd century AD, Heracles killed first Geryonois' shepherd Eurytion and the guard dog Orthos. He then sailed to Tartessos, presumably Geryonois' residence, and killed him too. The story is depicted on a masterpiece of archaic art from the time of Kolaios, found in the Iberian of Samos, the bronze breastplate of a horse harness. In the middle, Heracles, dressed in a lion's skin, fights the three-bodied Geryonois, under which the dog Orthos, struck by an arrow, lies. To the right of the center lies the dying Eurytion, also hit by an arrow, and on the left the stolen herd of cattle begins to move. In the Phoenician pantheon, Heracles corresponded to Melkart, the state god of Tyros, who had a famous temple in Gadir, which I will come later back to. The Old Testament offers further information about Tartessos. In 1646, the French Protestant theologian, Orientalist, geographer, and naturalist Samuel Bauchard was the first to link the toponym Tarshish, known from the Old Testament, with Tartessos in his Geographia Sacra Phalek at Canaan. Modern linguists have confirmed that Tarshish has no Semitic etymology and explained Tartessos and Tarshish as adaptations of an Iberian Tartessian name with the root tart or turt, to which the frequent Greek suffix sos, like kephisos, knossos, asessos, was added. This root is also found in later ethnic names referring to the same region, such as the Turdetanoi and Turduloi, above a reconstruction of the ethnography of the Iberian Peninsula in the 220 BC, who had direct knowledge of the Iberian Peninsula. In the Old Testament, Tarshish is mentioned several times in connection with Tyros in present-day Lebanon, which was the center of the Phoenician expansion into the central and western Mediterranean. Above is a representation of Tyros with its island location on one of the bronze bands of the gate of the palace of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal II, 883 to 59, in Imgur Endil, modern Balabat. The transformation of the island of Tyros into a peninsula only began in 333-32 BC with the siege ramp of Alexander the Great. The second book of Chronicles and the first book of Kings report of the partnership between the king Solomon of Israel and Hiram I of Tyros in the 10th century BC. Solomon in building the temple in Jerusalem by providing building materials and craftsmen. In 2 Chronicles 9:21 and almost identically in 1 Kings 10:22, Tarshish is also mentioned in connection with the joint activities of Solomon and Hiram. I quote, "The ships of the king traveled with Hiram's people to Tarshish and brought from there every 3 years gold, silver, ivory, monkeys, and peacocks." End of quote. Was doubted, as was also the person of Solomon, and thought to be an interpolation by the so-called Deuteronomistic reduction at the end of the Babylonian exile in 538 BC, but I will show later that archaeological evidence proves context between the Levant and the southwest of the Iberian Peninsula since the 11th, 10th centuries BC. During his far-reaching conquest, the Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal II, 883 to 59, also advanced against Tyros. The city preferred to pay tribute rather than face the Assyrian war machine. The types and quantities of tribute paid to Ashurnasirpal and his successors are meticulously recorded in the Assyrian Palace Archive and represented on the bronze banes of the Balawat gates, including gold, silver, tin, bronze, elephant tusks, purple fabrics, and monkeys. Interestingly, a number of these goods are also mentioned in the passage from the second book of the Chronicles quoted above, among the objects that Hiram and Solomon imported from Tarshish. A relief from the palace of Ashurnasirpal II in Nimrud shows Tyrians bringing North African Barbary monkeys who still live today in Gibraltar as tribute. The prophets Isaiah, 8th century BC, and Ezekiel, 7th century BC, announced God's judgment to Tyros. I quote, "The happy city that boasted of its age, that sent its settlers to the furthest reaches of the world, whose merchants were princes and whose traders were the most honorable lords in the world," Isaiah, which would receive a war, would be completely destroyed by the Assyrians and then by the Babylonians. Both mention Tarshish in this context, which provided trade for you, all kinds of wealth, silver, iron, and tin, among the goods it supplied. Ezekiel, the Tarshishites are to lament because Tyros is destroyed. Isaiah. But in fact, it was only Alexander the Great who destroyed Tyros in 332 BC. Another document that probably mentions Tarshish was found in Sardinia in 1773 in the wall of a modern vineyard near the Phoenician colony of Nora, the so-called Nora stele, which on the basis of paleographic evidence is dated to the period between the middle of the 9th and the first half of the 8th century BC. In the first line, a number of scholars read "to Tarshish" and interpret the inscription as a report of an exhibition to Tarshish. As we shall see, there is archaeological evidence for very early connections between Sardinia and Phoenicia on the one hand, and the southwest of the Iberian Peninsula on the other. Let us summarize the information that the ancient sources provide us about Tartessos. First, it was situated in the southwest of the Iberian Peninsula, beyond the Pillars of Heracles, on the Atlantic coast, Hekataios, Desicheros, Herodotus. Second, it was traversed by a river of the same name, Desicheros, Strabon. Third, it was a country with a capital of the same name, situated at the mouth of the river of the same name, Desicheros, Strabon, and had several cities, Hekataios. Fourth, it was rich in natural resources, silver and gold, Hekataios, Desicheros. Fifth, circa 630 BC, the Samian merchant Kolaios reached Tartessos and returned with great profit home, Herodotus. Sixth, it had a monarchy. In the late 7th and first half of the 6th century BC, It was reigned over many decades by a king named Arganthonios, Anacreon Herodotus. 7th, Arganthonios maintained friendly relations with the Phocaeans and financed their city wars against the Persians, Herodotus. 8th, there was a trade relation between Tyros and Tartessos. Second book of Chronicles, Isaiah, spectacular discoveries and excavation with legendary cities in the eastern Mediterranean, such as those made by Heinrich Schliemann in Troja and Mycenae, as well as by Arthur Evans in Knossos. The search for the legendary Tartessos began at the end of the 19th century. Based on the wealth of Tartessos under King Arganthonios, as related by Herodotus, it was imagined as a great metropolis, the capital of the first kingdom in the far west. The two founding fathers of Tartessian research were the British-French archaeologist and historian George Edward Bonso and the German philologist and historian Adolf Schulten. Bonso carried out excavations in a series of Iron Age tumulus cemeteries in the area around this town of Carmona, here east of Sevilla. Here is Carmona, on the Rio Guadalquivir, and thus became the discoverer of the Tartessian civilization. He published his finding in his books, Les colonies agricoles de la Vallée de Betis, Paris 1899. Betis, after which the Roman province of Hispania, Betia, was named, is a Roman name for today's Guadalquivir. In his book, Bonso documented his excavation results in an exemplary manner for the time. It was a pioneering work for the research into the hitherto unknown early history of the Iberian Peninsula. Bonso attributed a fundamental role in the cultural development of the region and on an agricultural colonization of the Guadalquivir Valley to the Phoenicians. Both Bonso and Schulten searched for the legendary city of Tartessos and finally joined forces to excavate at Serra del Trigo on the Donania Peninsula at the mouth of the Guadalquivir, here and here. However, where they believed Tartessos should be localized. However, the collaboration between Bonso and Schulten was problematic due to personal and professional disagreements. Furthermore, the excavation proved to be a failure. Only Roman ruins were uncovered. Although Bonso and Schulten had not found the legendary city of Tartessos, Schulten published the book Tartessos in 1922 in German and in 1924 in Spanish, in which he stuck to the localization of Tartessos in the Guadalquivir estuary. In contrast to the strong Semitic Phoenician element, for which Bonso and other scholars argued, for Schulten, Tartessos represented the Greek cultural heritage which spread from the Iberian Peninsula across the European continent. He believed that in the second millennium BC, Minoans from Crete had founded Tartessos and that it could be equated with Atlantis. He further developed this thesis in his 1927 book, Tartessos and Atlantis, and it has unfortunately remained in popular scientific literature until today. Here we see fantastic reconstructions of Atlantis at the estuary of the Guadalquivir based on Platon's description. Schulten blamed the decline of the Indo-European Greek Tartessos and the backwardness of the subsequent Iberian peoples on the Phoenicians, who had been, I quote, tainted by the Semitic and North African impurities. It is hardly surprising that Schulten's thesis, whose Tartessos book was reprinted several times after 1945, found a strong resonance in the fascist nationalist Franco regime. The fact that Bonso and Schulten had not succeeded in discovering Tartessos led to a series of alternative hypotheses from other scholars who wanted to localize Tartessos at various places marked on this map with red dots. From the south to the north, in the estuary of the Guadalete River, then to the estuary of the Guadalquivir River, and then that of the Tinto and Odiel rivers near Huelva. 8. A spectacular chance discovery by the archaeology of provided a new decisive impetus on the archaeology of Tartessos. On the hill of El Carambolo, 3 kilometers west of Sevilla, during construction work in a club for the cruel sport of pigeon shooting, a clay pot came to life. This contained the so-called treasure of El Carambolo, which consists of a group of 12 gold artifacts weighing a total of 3 kilograms, with rich ornamentation in filigree, granulation, and punching. 16 rectangular plates, 2 plates in the form of stylized bull skins, 2 bracelets, and a necklace with 7 pendants. And an article was dedicated to it in the renowned Illustrated London News, in which it was described as passion. Juan de Mata Carrioso, who carried out excavations at El Carambolo after the treasure had been discovered by chance, believed that the treasure was the crown jewels of the legendary Tartessian king Arganthonios mentioned by Herodotus. It was exhibited as such in the Archaeological Museum of Sevilla for a long time, as shown in the middle picture. On the right is an artistic version by the painter Juan Miguel Samos. 2 decades ago, this was the accepted interpretation of the El Carambolo treasure. For Spanish archaeology, the treasure was the equivalent of the so-called Priam's treasure from Troy, and the so-called Agamemnon's mask from Mycenae, in that it symbolized the golden age of a lost culture. However, renewed excavation at Carambolo between 2002 and 2004 have led to a completely different interpretation of the treasure. I will come back later to this. Our knowledge of the predecessors of Tartessian society is very limited. The most important information comes from late Bronze Age so-called warrior stelae, which were erected between the late 2nd and the early 1st millennium BC and show incised representations of men with swords and shields and chariots. On the left, you see a map of distribution map. Here is one of the most complex of them, the stele of Ateuga, which shows a funerary rite of aristocratic character. These stele attest to the existence of the warrior aristocracy, as does an important find in Huelva, which came to light in 1923 in the harbor on the map Deposito de Bronces. The so-called, here you can see, a ritual consecration, dedication of over 400 bronze objects from the 11th to 10th century BC, mainly thought of the so-called Huelva type. Some evidence points to early trans-Mediterranean ventures by risk-taking Phoenicians and Cypriots, and probably also Sardinians in the 11th and 10th centuries BC. The fibula with the swords in the Ria de Huelva hoard are of the earlier type of the so-called Cypriot fibula of the 11th to 10th centuries BC, which were widespread in Cyprus and the Levant. On the left is an example from 523 in Amathus. The fibula of the Rio de Huelva hoard are not direct imports from the Eastern Mediterranean, but imitations, which, however, presuppose knowledge of the prototypes. A roasting pit of Atlantic type also comes from the same tomb in Amathus. On the right is a map showing the distribution of this type. The early import of silver from the Levant to the southwest of the Iberian peninsula is evidenced by Newton activation analysis of hex silver, pre-coin money, in the Philistine city of Dor of the 11th century BC. In the 11th to 10th centuries BC, a new player came into the game of Mediterranean long-distance contacts, the Phoenicians, with Tyros, which rose to the metropolis of Phoenicia under King Hiram I, traditional dating 969 to 36 BC. The city was, as already mentioned, situated on an island 2 kilometers from the mainland, with according to Menander of Ephesus, circa 200 BC, who wrote a history of Tyros and translated the Tyrian annals into Greek for this purpose, Hiram I demolished the old temples of Melkart and Astarte, rebuilt them, and made Melkart the city god of Tyros. Herodotus traveled to Tyros to see the famous temple of Melkart and describes it, 244, as containing rich votive offerings and having two big columns, one of gold and the other of emerald. The priests there told him that this temple was very old. Menander of Ephesus reports that Hiram undertook a campaign against the Itikaeans, who had not paid their tribute. According to the Orientalist Wilhelm von Landau, Itikaios is to be read as Kitaios, and the city of Kition is meant. If this is correct, Kition was already under Tyrian rule in the 10th century BC, and perhaps an intermediate station on the way to the Western Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence of Phoenician presence in Kition, however, only dates from the late 9th century BC. As Vassos Karagiorgis has aptly noted, however, one must assume that the Phoenicians were already active in Cyprus in the 11th century BC in order to acquire copper. Indication of the early presence of Phoenicians on Cyprus are the fragment of a local bowl of the bichromware of the 9th century BC found in Salamis, with a short Phoenician inscription painted on it before it was fired, mentioning either the god Melkart or the goddess Astarte, and a contemporary stele of unknown provenance with a Phoenician funerary inscription in the Museum of Nicosia. In Kition, at the end of the 9th century, after a hiatus of almost 200 years in this area, the new temple too of Astarte was built over the ruins of the late Bronze Age temple. Below are votive offerings from apostles belonging to Temple 3. Kition received the Phoenician name Kardadasht, new city. The name is the same as later Carthago. Two fragmentary bronze bowl from 730 BC, bought from a scrap metal dealer in Limassol in 1874, bear the identical Phoenician dedicatory inscription of a governor of Kardadash, servant of Hiram II of Tyros Tubal of Lebanon. Assyrian hegemony over Kition is attested by this stele, which Sargon II had erected in Kition, and which mentions a victory festival in Babylon in 1707 BC. Tyros was the most important port of trade for the Assyrian overlords, where goods from the Phoenician colonies in the west arrived. In the inscription on an alabaster plate from Nineveh, King Ashahadon of Assyria claims to rule over all countries in the Mediterranean, from Cyprus and Greece to Tarshish. For a long time, it was assumed that Phoenician contact with the Iberian Peninsula did not begin until the 8th century BC. It has since been shown that Phoenician ships reached the west coast of Andalusia as early as the late 10th century BC. Spectacular evidence of a Phoenician presence from the second half of the 10th century has been coming to light in Huelva since 1998. During the excavation for the foundation of a multi-story car park between Calle Méndez Núñez and Plaza de las Monjas, 80 centimeters of settlement debris was found at a depth of 5 to 6 meters below the groundwater level, above a level of sedimentary deposits from the Tinto and Udiel rivers. A further excavation in 2009 to 10 in Calle Concepcion, 43 meters away, supplemented these findings. This is the first publication by Fernando González de Canales and others from 2004. Radiocarbon dating of the cattle bones found in this stratum yielded dates between the second half of the 10th and the middle of the 9th century BC. The largest part of the imported ceramics with 3,000 fragments, 90%, are tableware and amphora from Tyros, several of the latter with Phoenician graffiti. 33 fragments come from Greece, from sub-proto-geometric 2 to 3, possibly also 1, Euboean sciphoi plates with hanging semicircles decoration, and Euboean or Attic middle geometric 2 cantharoi and sciphoi. The fragment of an Attic middle geometric 2 pyxid shoulder shows a horse, showing a horse had already been discovered in 1977 during an emergency excavation. On the right, a complete parallel from the Keramikos in Athens. 5 fragments of jugs of Cypriot black and red ware were found in the Carriamun Mendes Nunez finds brook. 28 fragments of ascoi and amphora from Sardinia, and 2 fragments of Villanovan pottery came from central Italy. In addition to the ceramics, imports of other materials were also found. Ivory, which testifies to the existence of an ivory workshop, and agate chunks, probably raw materials of precious metals such as gold and silver, is attested by the presence of cubic lake weights calibrated according to the so-called Syrian or Ugaritic shekel of 9.4 to 9.6 grams. Furthermore, evidence for metallurgical activities have come to light, including brick from a furnace wall, clay nozzles, casting crucibles with copper slags still stuck to the inside, and a tin plate with perforations that was used to obtain consistent quantities of tin for the alloying process to produce bronze. The finds of 5 betyloi, 4 made of limestone and 1 of basalt, indicate Phoenician cult. In the Levant, the installation of betyloi in temples has a long tradition. On the left, you see the so-called obelisk temple in Byblos from the period between 1900 and 1600 BC. The betyloi were often referred to as dwelling place of the deity and are to be understood as aniconic images of deities. This is also demonstrated by a betyl from Paterna del Campo, Huelva, in the center, which bears a representation of the winged goddess Astarte. On a stele from the Phoenician colony of Nora in Sicily, 3 betyloi are depicted on a common base. A parallel for the betyl at Huelva is provided by the Temple B in Komos on the south coast of Crete, built in the late 9th to early 8th centuries BC. In this temple, there was a base with 3 betyloi, as depicted on the younger stele from Nora, which we had just seen. The contemporary temple of Tanit Astarte in Sarepta, north of Tyros here, is comparable. In both temples, there are benches running around the wall and apart. In Sarepta, a lost betyl forms the focus of the cut, of which only the base remains. In Temple B at Komos, 2 Phoenician faience statuettes of Egyptian deities were placed, Sekhmet left and Nefertum center. Faience statuettes of Egyptian deities were also found in the temple of Tanit Astarte in Sarepta on the right. At Komos, Temple A preceding Temple B date from the earlier 9th century BC. More than 200 fragments of Phoenician transport amphora, which according to clay analysis came from Tyros, were found in the votive dumps of the 2 temples. According to the convincing interpretation of the excavator Joseph Shaw, Komos was an important intermediate station on the route of the Phoenicians to the west from the 9th century BC on, and the native Cretans allowed the Phoenicians to build a temple here in which they could ask their gods for protection for travel and trade. Further evidence of Phoenician was provided by testimonies of ox sacrifices, ox skulls with cut off. They were also found in the sanctuary, in the Phoenician sanctuary of Astarte in Kition. The arm of a bronze votive statue found in the port of Huelva, and 3 bronze statues of striding male figures wearing the Egyptian apron costume and the Atef crown, the crown of Upper Egypt, an attribute of the Egyptian god Osiris, who was equated with the Phoenician god Melkart as god of death and rebirth. One of the statues left was found during an illegal excavation in the city area. The other 2 were found by divers in the sea of the Isla del Tartessos, where they had possibly been thrown into the sea by Phoenician sailors as offerings for a safe journey. Grape seeds, Vitis vinifera, were found in the Calle Concepcion deposit. Carbon-14 dates show that they date from the 10th century BC and are the oldest evidence of wine cultivation on the Iberian Peninsula. In 2005, 3 kilometers north of the old settlement, at the Orden Seminario de Huelva, furrows of vineyards were identified. Thus, it was the Phoenicians who introduced the viticulture in the Iberian Peninsula. The location of the settlement of Huelva in the bay between the estuaries of the Rio Odiel and the Rio Tinto was a fundamental condition for the early presence of the Phoenicians and the development of the port settlement. Extensive silver deposits lie north of Huelva and the Sierra Morena in the area of the rivers Odiel and Tinto, the Red River, whose color comes from the high concentration of iron salts and sulfates from the still active mining industry at the headwaters of the river. Metals have been mined and processed here since the Chalcolithic. These activities intensified in the late Bronze Age. Sites with metallurgical activities are marked with black dots on the map at the bottom left. The local elites retain control over mining and the transport of the material to the ports, where the Phoenicians then organized its export. This was a win-win situation for both parties. How should the findings at Huelva be interpreted? It was not, as with the later Phoenician colonies in the southwest of the Iberian Peninsula in North Africa, a new foundation, but rather the Phoenicians created a trading post in Emporion in the context of an existing settlement and certainly with the concept of the local publication. The rich finds from Huelva have led Fernando González de Canales to the theory in his book Dal Occidente Mitico Grego hasta Tartessos of 2004 that Huelva was the city of Tartessos. However, in 2024, he was contradicted by a group of geologists, archaeologists, historians, and philologists who argued for the location of the city of Tartessos further to the south, in the estuary of the Guadiana, which according to geometrical, this estuary looked, according to geomorphological studies, like shown on the map on the right side. We also refer to literary sources, in particular to Rufus Festius Avienus, 2nd century AD, from Volsini I Bolsena, governor in Greece and North Africa, who wrote a poem entitled Ora Maritima, in which he describes the Mediterranean coast of Europe from the Atlantic to the Black Sea, based on Greek and possibly Carthaginian sources from the 6th century BC. The part concerning the Iberian Peninsula mentions city and ports whose positions had already been forgotten in Hellenistic and Roman times. According to Avienus, the city Civitas was located on the island of Cartere, a name of Phoenician etymology, at the mouth of the Tartessos River. The research group identified the island of Cartere with the present-day peninsula La Algida, which was an island until the Roman Empire. Excavations are planned to verify this theory archaeologically. If this identification is correct, the Tartessos River is either the Ria Guadalquivir or the Rio Guadiamar. The group of scientists recalls Stesichoros, who speaks of the silver-bearing roots of the Tartessos River and tends towards the Guadiamar, which rises in the orange western Sierra Morena. Huelva is the oldest known pre-colonial Phoenician enclave in the west. In the second half of the 9th century BC, however, two more were added. In Sardinia, at the Nuragic settlement of Sant Iberian, and on the south coast of Andalusia, southwest of Malaga, at La Rebandilla. Sant Iberian was close to important copper mines. The discovery of copper plates weighing 130 kilograms in one room suggests that copper bars were produced here for export. On Rebandilla Island, at the mouth of the Guadalhorce River, which was investigated in connection with the expansion of the Malaga airport, pits with evidence of copper smelting were uncovered from the oldest phase. According to the interpretation of Eduardo Garcia Alonso, La Rebanadilla in this phase probably formed a meeting place between the indigenous people and the Phoenicians. Their ritual was promoted exchange between the elites. The mountains in the hinterland of Malaga are rich in copper deposits, black triangles. The origins of Phoenician contact with the West in the pre-colonial phase were thus linked to the search of metals and the exploration of lands particularly rich in them. According to radiocarbon dates and archaeological evidence, the colonial phase of Phoenician expansion began in the second half of the 9th century BC. Regarding Gadir, today's Cadiz, the Roman historian Marcus Velleius Paterculus tells in his Historia Romana, written around 10 to 20 AD, that, I quote, "The inhabitants of Tyros, who ruled the seas with their fleet, founded Gadir in the furthest corner of Spain, at the outermost borders of our empire, on an island surrounded by the ocean and separated from the mainland by a narrow strait," end of quote. The date of this foundation was unclear for a long time. That given by Kolaios Paterculus 80 years after the fall of Troy, that means in 1144 to 3 BC, seemed too high in any case. It was only the excavations of the year 2006 to 10 under the Teatro Comico at the highest point of Eritrea that opened a window into the founding phase of Gadir. Over the remains of a Bronze Age indigenous settlement in Layer 1, the ruins of 8 Phoenician-style houses with rectangular ground plans and mud brick walls on rubble stone foundations came to light in Layer 2, late 9th to mid-8th century BC. They indicate an urban character with dense layout and paved streets. Also noteworthy is the bread oven of the Tanur type, bottom right, which is known from Phoenicia. The pottery found in the houses consists to 60 to 70% wheel-turned Phoenician vessels, numbers 1 to 3, and 30 to 40% of local handmade vessels, numbers 4, 5. And escuillac number 6, bottom right, originated from Sardinia. Phoenician person names, which were scratched onto locally made storage vessels as a form of ownership marking, top left, prove that the Phoenician script was regularly used by people living in Gadir. A group of clay seals with impression of Phoenician scarabs had sealed papyrus documents, bottom right, a microscope photo, which were intended for the archive of the city or of a temple. At the mouth of Guadalhorce River, west of Malaga, the second phase of La Rebanadilla, which falls within the last quarter of the 9th century BC to the beginning of the 8th century BC, is characterized by the appearance of urban structures of domestic architecture of Phoenician type with rectangular floor plans. In one of the buildings, finds were made as testi, as you can see here. In one of the buildings, finds were made that testify to a religious function of Phoenician character, a basin sunk into the ground next to which stood a batilus and a thimiaterna. In the ceramic repertoire, large handmade vessels of local tradition, top left, and Phoenician wheel-turned amphora, top right, were used for kitchenware, bottom left, consists of handmade vessels of local tradition. The fine ware made on the purpose wheel, bottom right, often with the characteristic red slip, is Phoenician. There were also imports from Sardinia and Greece, Iberian skifoil of the middle geometric two-phase. The associated necropolis of Cortijo de San Isidoro shows characteristic Phoenician burial rites with cremations in craters or amphora used as urns, accompanied by a set of decanter, ewer with neck ring and cup, as found also in the contemporary Albast necropolis of Tyros. 3 of the urns contained Egyptianizing scarabs made in Tyros, a Phoenician burial custom also found. Morro de Mesquitilla, another Phoenician colony founded during this period, will not be discussed here. Instead, we cross over to North Africa, where Phoenician, Greek, and Sardinian ceramics have been found in the lowest layer at the Phoenician colony of Utica, at the mouth of the Bagadras River. Bottom center, you see Iberian middle geometric 2 ceramics. A metallurgical furnace, as well as fragments of bellows and slag, prove that copper was melted here. Carbon-14 dating of seeds and animal bones has revealed that the city was founded in the last quarter of the 9th century BC. Carthago is situated only 3 kilometers southeast of Utica in a wide bay protected from the fierce northwesterly winds in winter on the tip of a peninsula north of present-day Tunis. On the right is a map of the archaic city area based on the results of the excavations by the University of Hamburg, Amsterdam, and Ghent, and the Institut National du Patrimoine. According to legend, Carthago was founded by the Tyrian princess Elissa, called Dido by the Romans. The historian Dionysius of Halicarnassos, 54 to after 7 BC, based on earlier sources, dated the founding of the city to 38 years before the first Olympiad in 776, thus to the year 814 BC. However, it was only the Hamburg excavation under the direction of Hans-Georg Niemeyer between 1986 and 93 that provided archaeological insight into the early phases of Carthago. Here is a plan and a reconstruction of phase 1. Radiocarbon dating of samples from test trenches by the University of Ghent dated the founding of Carthago to the first quarter of the 8th century BC. What role did Euboea play in this early context in the Mediterranean? In the 10th century BC, the island had developed an economically prosperous and international networked society, as evidenced by the find from Lefkandi. The so-called Heron, 50 meters long and 10 meters wide, is the first known large building in Greece after the decline of the Mycenaean civilization, and covered an exceptional double burial. In the burial shaft, the cremation burial of a man and of a woman burial too were found. A Cypriot bronze amphora was used as an urn for the man's ashes. His weapon, sword, and spear were placed with him. The woman was buried with rich gold jewelry, including a Babylonian necklace above. The skeletons of 4 horses were found in a second grave shaft. The man buried here with his wife was undoubtedly an important personage with international connections. The area to the east of the building was covered by a tumulus, was used as a cemetery. The people buried here were members of an elite group, and they were given rich grave goods, including imports from Phoenicia and Cyprus. Here, this is, sorry, of particular interest is tomb 79, which the excavators Mervyn Popham and Irene Lemos have named as the grave of the Iberian warrior trader. The ashes of the dead men were buried in a bronze cauldron. The iron weapon of the men, a sword, a spearhead, and arrowheads, identify him as a warrior. 16 stone weights as a trader. According to John Crowell's research, the weights are calibrated according to the 3 Phoenician standards. A North Syrian cylinder seal and Phoenician jugs also show connections to the Levant. Early geometric tomb pottery dates the tomb to the early 9th century BC. The earliest Euboean ceramic imports in Tyros date from the time of the Heroon of Lefkandi, the fragments of a Skiphos #1, with parallels in Lefkandi #2 and Amatus on Cyprus, and an amphora with decoration that can find parallels on amphora from the Heroon. From layer 10 onwards, the characteristic Euboean subprotogeometric Skiphoid plates with hanging half circles appeared, which were then soon distributed throughout the entire Levant and Cyprus. Were the Euboeans actors in this network of only passive receivers? While a number of scholars attribute an active role to the Euboeans of Lefkandi, John Papadopoulos, who is present here tonight, and I hope he will forgive me, in an article in 1997 with the provocative article Phantom Euboeans, thinks that Lefkandi may have been a place where enterprising Easterners, whether Phoenicians, North Syrians, or Cypriots, settled and where Greeks and Easterners coexisted. In regards to the tomb of the warrior trader, he argues that a more straightforward and elegant interpretation is that of an Easterner buried in Euboea. I can't see any evidence of the actual presence of Easterners at Lefkandi. The burial custom is local, and the grave of the warrior trader has a Greek burial custom, as I said. The Euboean ceramics that reached the Iberian Peninsula at the beginning probably came on Phoenician ships, possibly with mixed crews, as also thought by Notakuru. In a second phase, Euboean and subprotogeometric ceramics may arrive to the West, probably in joint ventures or on the first Euboean ships of their own. Strabon 549 and Livius 22:5-6 tell of Euboean pioneers at Pithecusae on Ischia in the Gulf of Neapel. This first Greek colony in the West was founded towards the end of the 9th century BC, as evidenced by fragments of Middle Geometric 2 chevron Skiphoi unearthed in the settlement on Monte di Vico. The reason for this foundation was certainly the rich deposits of iron ore, copper, and silver in the Colline Metallifere, the metal-bearing hills in central and southern Tuscany and on Elba. Besides the majority of Greeks, Orientals were also present in Pithecusae. This is evident from the finds of characteristic Phoenician ceramics with red slip, imported and locally produced by the Phoenician trade amphora, but above all by epigraphical evidence. On the fragment of a cup made in Pithecusae, 2 Semitic signs, A, L, probably part of an owner's inscription, have been preserved. Into an imported Greek transport amphora that had been reused for the intrismos burial of an infant, 5 graffiti were inside. Those on one side refer to its original use as a trade vessel and give measurements in Aramaic numerals. The Greek letters phi and iota are incised under one handle. On the other side are two signs that are related to the secondary function of the amphora as container for child's burial. The triangle with two sides extended beyond the apex represents a religious symbol that refers to death and life after death. The other sign is the letter chet and is the initial of the word hin if Aramaic or hym if Phoenician, that means life. There is evidence that the Euboeans were also present early on the Tunisian coast west of Carthago and Utica. Literary sources speak of Euboean settlements there. The main source is the Periplus of Pseudo-Scylax from the 4th century BC, which describes the sea route around the Mediterranean and Black Sea and certainly integrates all the sources. In paragraph 111, the author continues westwards after describing Carthago and Utica. After Utica, comes Horse Cup, Fort Hippu Acra, where there is a lake with islands in it, and around the lake the following cities: Psegas, a polis, and just opposite many Naxian islands, Naxiaca. Then Pithecusa with a harbor, and opposite this an island, and on the island a polis called Euboea. As John Boardman has discussed, the Euboean connections of some of the names are clear. Euboea itself, Naxos, the Cycladic island with which Euboea was closely associated, and this was also the first name of the first Euboean colony in Sicily, and Pithecusa. These names, according to Boardman, could hardly have been given by Greeks after Carthago had taken control of the Tunisian coast. Once given, these names remained in the memory of Greek seafarers. The name Pillars of Briareos, an alternative name for the Pillars of Heracles, as handed down by Aristoteles, also points to Euboea. Briareos, one of the 300-armed, 50-headed Hekatoncheires, son of Uranos and Gaia, added with his brothers Zeus against the attack by the Titans. He was genealogically connected to Euboea and had a cult there. From the late 9th century BC, more and more Phoenician settlements were founded on the southern coast of Andalusia, lined up like the pearls of a necklace on the southern coast, and used almost all usable harbor bays and river mouths. So today's Costa del Sol was a Phoenician coast in those days. A characteristic example of Phoenician settlements on the southern coast of Andalusia is Toscanos here. It was founded around the middle of the 8th century BC. During the excavations in the 1960s by two German pioneers of Phoenician research on the Iberian Peninsula, Hermann Fried Schubert and Hans-Georg Niemeyer, residences and warehouses came to light. A paved quay has been found on the former riverbank. As in the other Phoenician colonies, the evidence suggests that in addition to trade, the main occupations were metalworking, purple dye production, agriculture, cattle and sheep breeding, as well as fishing. In the estuary of the river Guadalhorce, west of Malaga, the population of Rebanadilla moved due to the alluvial silting of the river in 1770-60 from the island to Serra de Villar, which is located 2 kilometers further southeast. This settlement had an urban infrastructure with a harbor streets, including a 5-meter wide market street with shops, residential and artisan quarters, with metallurgical workshops for silver, copper, and iron, as well as pottery. The finds of 3 Phoenician-type lead weights, calibrated according to the Tyrian weight system, testify to the function of Serra de Villar as a marketplace. Evidence of social stratification in the Phoenician colonies can be found mainly in the burial customs. The tombs of the elite families were underground chamber tombs built of ashlar, so-called hypogea, such as tomb 1 of Traiamar. Such tombs exist also in the Phoenician mother country, for instance in Arzif, in present-day northern Israel below. The deceased were buried with rich gold jewelry, as here in Traiamar tomb 4, including a pendant with Egyptian religious iconography, a mountain flanked by birds and surmounted by the moon and the sun, as well as a falcon with outstretched wings, a divine determinative. The ashes of the wealthy deceased were buried in alabaster vessels, most of them of Egyptian origin, often with engraved cartouche of the pharaohs. The vessel at the top right is engraved with the Phoenician inscription, Ashes of Magon, son of HLS. There's much debate about how this largest collection of Egyptian alabaster vases outside of Egypt, about 70 pieces, came to Andalusia. In Egypt, alabaster vessels were gifts of great value mentioned in the sources in connection with the divinity and kingship of the pharaohs, and found in sacred and royal contexts such as temples, palaces, and royal tombs. They arrived in the palaces of the Near East as diplomatic gifts and containers of prestige products for exclusive use, purple and wine. However, the Egyptian alabaster vases ended up in the Iberian peninsula. There are a number of theories about this. Their prestigious role is beyond doubt. Two of the Phoenician colonies developed into urban centers in the 7th century BC. Gadir, today's Cadiz, and Malacca, today's Malacca. Since both are located below the present-day cities, our information about them is unfortunately quite limited. In Gadir, Cadiz, the necropolis, which was located in the north of the island of Cotinusa, was partially excavated at the double city gate Puertos de Tierra. Here is a plan of a grave with cremation, a grave stele in Phoenician ceramics, a Sardinian ascos, and jewelry. Unfortunately, almost nothing remains of the monumental religious architecture of Gadir reported in ancient sources. The island of Erythia was also known as Aphrodisias in the Greek pantheon. According to Plinius and Strabon, it was located on the western side of the island, presumably at the site of present-day Punta Denao. A censer and a terracotta protomb of a buried man from the 6th century BC were found in the sea near the Punta de la Nao. Similar protombs from other Phoenician colonies in the Mediterranean area had a ritual function either in graves or in sanctuaries. The temple of Kronos on the northern part of the island of Kotinosa, mentioned by Strabon and Plinius, was dedicated to the Phoenician god Baal Hamon, which was identified with Kronos by the Greeks. It was probably located on the site of the present island of San Sebastian Castle, here. A limestone capital of Phoenician type, which probably came from this temple, was found in the sea nearby the island, and on the right you see a parallel from Hatzor in present days northern Israel. In the extreme south of Cotinusa, on the present-day island of Sancti Petri, the famous temple of the Tyrian state god Melkart was situated, who was a patron of colonization and was soon identified with the Greek hero Heracles. The temple of Melkart Heracles was still characterized by the Phoenician architecture and rituals in Hellenistic and Roman times, as reported by various ancient writers, including Diodorus Siculus, Strabon, Arianos, and Celius Italicus. Here is a reconstruction of the temple based on the description of these authors. Divers have found numerous bronze statues of striding male figures scattered around the island. They are wearing Egyptian loincloths and atef crowns, which were worn in Upper Egypt and were an attribute of the Egyptian god Osiris, who was equated with Melkart. The statues, which can be dated to the 8th and 7th centuries BC, were certainly dedicated to votive offerings in the sanctuary of Melkart. The settlement of Cerro de Villar at the mouth of the Guadalhorce River was abandoned in the second half of the 7th century BC due to the further silting up of the river. The inhabitants settled further east at the mouth of the Guadalmadina River and the Phoenician settlement of Malaca, which, as I said, lies beneath the present-day old city of Malaga. On the left, you see a map of the remains of Malaga from the 7th and 6th century BC that were excavated between 1980, 81 and 2006. Houses, metals making, furnaces, an urban sanctuary, and the Phoenician city wall from the 6th century BC. When the Palacio de la Buenavista was converted into the Museo Picasso de Malaga, Picasso's native city, in 1998 to 2001, the ruins of the Phoenician settlement from the second half of the 7th and the early 6th century were found under the building. At another site, Calle Sister 3, number 8 on the plan, a sanctuary above and a potter's kiln in its immediate vicinity were uncovered. Graves from this period are not yet known. The stray find of the so-called Medallon de Malaga, a gold object showing a pharaoh slaying his enemies in Egyptian manner, can be seen as an indication that there existed Phoenician graves with rich grave goods. In the first half of the 6th century BC, Malacca was surrounded by a first fortification wall, in black in the plan, and at the turn of the 6th to the 5th century BC by a second one in gray. Both walls are casemate walls, as are characteristic of the Phoenician mother country. At the bottom right, you can see a wall of this type in the Tyrian border fortress of Tel Kabri in northern Israel, which my wife and I have excavated together with Aaron Kompinski from the University of Tel Aviv. The hill on which the Alcazaba was later built probably formed the Acropolis of Malaga. The discovery of prestige objects on the slope, a bronze applique decorated with a palmette, a jug handle with an effigy for which an origin from Tyre to Etruria or Marseille has been suggested, and an ivory plate with an Egyptian motif can be understood as an indication that the Alcazaba hill was the seat of the elite. 3 ships, which sank in the second half of the 7th century BC on their way east, bear witness to the export activities of the West Phoenician seafarers and traders. The wreck of the Bajo de la Campania near Cartagena had a cargo of West Phoenician amphora from the 7th to 6th centuries BC. It also contained a series of lead weights of the Tyrian standard and raw materials such as 163 tin ingots from Galicia, more than a ton of galena lumps for the extraction of silver, 7 copper ingots, and many copper fragments, as well as 54 teeth of North African elephants. 9 of them bear Phoenician inscriptions, proper names that either stand alone or are combined with a plea for blessing. The 2 shipwrecks of Mazarón came to light about 70 kilometers further east. Mazarón, too, is almost completely preserved. From bow to stern, it was filled with 20 kilograms of galena ingots. With the founding of the first Phoenician colonies in the southwest of the Iberian Peninsula, the phenomenon of entanglement, that means partial cultural assimilation of the Tartessian and the Phoenicians, can be observed. This means that Tartessos became part of the orientalizing koine of large parts of the Mediterranean, from Greece via Italy, Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, to the Iberian Peninsula, marked on this map by hatching, in the development of which the Phoenicians played a decisive role. The fortified city of Los Castillejos de Alcorín is a characteristic early example. It is situated 25 kilometers west of Gibraltar, 2.5 kilometers from the sea at a height of 165 meters, in a favorable location with a view in all directions, and thus provided the best conditions for controlling the surrounding area and coast. According to C14 dating, it was founded towards the end of the 9th century BC and abandoned around 750 BC. According to the results of the excavations under Dirce Mazzoli in collaboration with Spanish colleagues, it is a native settlement. Native handmade goods, pottery, make up 97% of the ceramic finds. The remaining 3 are Phoenician imports of wheel-thrown ceramics. Bottom right, a fragment of a Phoenician amphora. Of particular interest is a fragment of a transport or storage vessel of local manufacture from the late 9th century BC, into which a Phoenician graffito was carved before firing, indicating a gift or dedication. Number 9, bottom right, is a photo in situ. In the architecture, the inhabitants of Alcorin adapted the rectangular building type with stone foundations and mud brick walls. The use of shells to pave the streets also has no indigenous tradition, but comes from the Levant. Among the economically utilized resources of Alcorin was, above all, iron, which was mined nearby. In the settlement, slag from smelting was found, indicating that the iron was smelted here and then probably delivered to other places where the metal was further processed and forged. Alcorin thus represents the interesting case of a native center of power and trade that developed in close contact with the first Phoenician settlements. Alcorin is not located in the nucleus here is the nucleus of Tartessos, but in the periphery. Important Tartessian cities, such as Huelva, Sevilla, and Carmona, lie under the present-day cities and are therefore inaccessible to archaeologists for the most part. Thus, the Tartessian civilization is mainly tangible for us in the funerary area and in extra-urban sanctuaries. Sven Beta has divided the Tartessian graves into 3 groups. Simple graves are top left, urn graves with modest grave goods, mostly only pottery. Then rich graves, B, bottom left, tumulus graves with richer grave goods, including weapons, gold jewelry, and ivory carvings. And finally, princely graves, tombs, on the right screen, larger tumulus graves with very rich grave goods, including weapons, bronze and silver vessels, gold jewelry, and in one case, a chariot. By far the